Recording. There you go. So welcome to the February book club meeting. And this month we read Mercury Pictures Presents by Anthony Marra. And we have Mr. Marra on the phone. Tony, hello, welcome. We enjoy having you here. Where are you calling us from tonight, Tony?
I am calling from New Haven, Connecticut.
Connecticut. Okay. I don't know how many of y'all from Connecticut. Anybody, well, I'm sure will raise their hand or say something, but welcome. We're glad to have you. And I want to first off, thank you for writing such a rich book. It was so descriptive, so much backstory. It really, I think, put us there in the 1930s, early 1940s, in Los Angeles, in the movie business, and also in Italy and some of those other far off places. And it really showed another side of World War II and the lead up to that I don't think that I really knew a whole lot about. And so I just want to thank you for bringing this story to the world. And then as we get started, I wanted to ask you, I read the author's notes and I realized there was some inspiration from your partner, Cappy. Is that who kind of inspired you to do this? And then I really wanted to sort of pick your brain in terms of how did you decide on this particular story and this angle based on your friends, your partners, experience and film documentation and the work that they've done.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join you this evening. This is an absolute treat. I don't take these opportunities lightly, and I'm grateful to you all for taking time out of your schedule to tune in. It's interesting. Maybe I'll answer the second half of the question first, which is you mentioned that this was sort of a World War II novel that perhaps takes a slightly different approach to that conflict. Like many readers, I think there's something inherently really dramatic and fascinating about World War II on the page. I think that it is to our contemporary world what the Trojan War was to antiquity, in that it is a conflict that has become this mythologized way for us to look at human evil and goodness. But of course, we can't walk into a bookstore without tripping over a very tall stack of World War II books. And so if I was going to write something set in that period, it felt really important to take sort of a slightly different view of it. My wife, Cappy, grew up in Long Beach, and she is a photo historian. And so over the years, as I've worked on different projects, I've found that my own interests and work, in some ways dovetails with hers. And one of the ways that this book began was with a collection of photographs from the American Civil War, actually, that she showed me. So this was about 10 years before, after the advent of photography. And in those photographs, which are sort of really our main way of sort of picturing what the American Civil War was, many of them were staged. And this idea that our historical memory of the Civil War is in some ways shaped by staged photographs sort of became something that I had been thinking about for some time, and that's one of the entry points into this book. I should say also on the topic of sort of Cappy and sort of how one shares one's work with with one's family. I began working on this book in 2014. And my first two books had each taken around 2 years to write. So I figured that I was going to be done with this while Obama was still in office. And needless to say, it didn't quite work out like that. And during the pandemic, so we were living at the time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in this tiny one-bedroom apartment with a truly alarming number of closets. It was a one-bedroom apartment with about 9 different closets. Everything was in its own closet. The refrigerator was in a closet. And my office was a closet that I'd managed to wedge a desk into. And at this point, I had been struggling with finding the right tone for the book. And that had been the thing that was really had challenged me for years. And when the lockdowns began, for the first time, I didn't walk by the closet with, a sense of dread and fear. I realized that, the blank page sort of became my escape hatch. And at a time when, when we couldn't travel anywhere, this book became a way for me to travel, and the tone of the book became much more sort of sardonic and much more humorous. And I realized that sense of humor and irony was what was missing from it. And I used to give Cappy pages from once I'd finished a chapter or a couple of chapters, I would give them to her. And I remember, sitting in my closet with the door closed and hearing her laugh through the wall. And that was kind of the moment where I realized, okay, like I found something here. This is what I need to pursue.
Well, that was one of my questions, interestingly enough. I was going to ask you, based on, my own writing and knowing how long it takes to add those descriptions and some of that anecdotal, narrative into a novel, and the backstory and all that good stuff, it takes a lot of time. And so, most of us can maybe write the first draft in 9 months to a year, but then you got the whole other year of edits and, development editors tearing it apart and saying, no. And then you have, the copy editors, just, and so I was thinking, okay, there's a lot of descriptions and, and just very interesting language in this narrative, not just the dialogue, the narrative. And I think this took an awfully long time to write. So I was going to ask you how long it took. So in terms of actual writing and working on it, you started in 2014, but what do you think? 3 years in terms of the actual first draft?
So I'm ashamed, somewhat abashed to admit it. It took the first draft was 6 years. 6 years, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
you can certainly see it in the work. My hat's off to you on that. So how did you decide? Well, how did you decide the story? I guess because of your wife's work. But in terms of the parallel with the Warner Brothers and the Italian story, I understand, is from your own heritage in a lot of ways. But how did you fall upon, the Feldman brothers, i.e., the Warner Brothers, in terms of that angle of the story?
Yeah. So one of the I was sort of going. So I should say my first 2 novels were set in the former Soviet Union, and after writing 2 books set in Russia, I was ready to come in from the cold, and
literally.
Yeah, exactly. We're better to warm up than Italy and Los Angeles. And so I used to live in LA. I went to school there and lived there afterwards. When I began, I've spent most of my adult life in California. And the period of LA history in which there was this huge influx of emigres and refugees fleeing the war in Europe had always just sort of fascinated me. There's this wonderful Frank Lloyd Wright quote in which he says that if you tip the world on its side, all the loose pieces will land in Los Angeles. And that was...
I used to have a guy that I worked with who actually his grandfather was the voice of Donald Duck. And he used to say that, if you shook, if the United States was on a board and you shook it, what wasn't screwed down tightly would roll into California. So he had something similar he used to.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, it's in some ways it's
no
true.
Offense, Janet, who's from California or something that I know.
I am too.
Okay. Sorry, Mona, but you know what I'm talking about. I got a house out there. I get it.
I do.
Yeah, and so that period in LA history always just seems so fascinating, particularly as some of these exiles who went to work in Hollywood, Fritz Lang or Billy Wilder or Greta Garbo are very famous figures. But I was more interested in looking at how the lives of former prominent people who really didn't get much of a leg up in LA, how they fared. So that had been a project that I was had been just kicking around in the back of my mind. And at the same time, following after I wrote my second book, I was also considering a novel set in southern Italy. And so I had these two ideas that to me seemed like totally separate books. And I have difficulty committing to an appetizer, let alone a multi-year book project. So for some months I was going back and forth between the two of them, and things finally came together when my wife and I went to Lipari, which is a tiny island off the coast of Sicily that my great grandmother is from. And it's this volcanic island with wind-swept beaches and beautiful views. If anybody has seen the movie Il Postino, it was filmed there. And on one of our last days there, we saw this plaque on the wall of the Lipari Citadel that was erected to commemorate the various anti-fascists and intellectuals who had been sentenced to internal exile on Lipari by the fascist regime. And I had never heard this particular chapter in the island's history before. It had never come up in my discussions with my relatives, and it just seemed so surreal that this island paradise to which I could trace my own roots had once been Mussolini's Alcatraz. And I remember as I stood there, the phrase "sunny Siberia" came to my mind, because that's something that German and Austrian refugees in Los Angeles, that was a term that they sometimes in tongue-in-cheek used to describe LA, sunny Siberia. And it seemed that the internal exiles on Lipari in southern Italy might have used that exact same term to describe the island. And it in that moment, I sort of realized that these weren't two separate projects, but were rather halves of the same novel. And that it would be a story of these two sunny Siberias on either ends of the world, and this one family divided between them.
Interesting. And so in terms of the Warner Brothers, how much of this, can you give us a sense of the truth in the story, the parallels back to them versus, what's sort of made up? I mean, I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, so
take.
Absolutely. So in the broad stroke, so I envisioned Mercury Pictures as sort of a poverty road down market version of the Warner Brothers. So the Warner Brothers
Poverty version, that's great.
Yeah. So during there were five big sort of major film studios, of which after MGM, Warner Brothers was probably the most prominent. And one of the things that really sort of set Warner Brothers apart throughout this era is that their movies really often had this very sort of social message to them. So they wrote movies about, they produced movies about, the underworld. Many of the great gangster movies of the 30s were produced by the Warner Brothers because they wanted to sort of expose what the mafia was doing to immigrant communities. They had, a movie called "I Was a Fugitive from a Chain Gang," sort of about chain gangs in the South. They were among the very first. They were, in fact, the first major movie studio to produce movies that were adamantly anti-Nazi. And for this, Harry Warner was hauled in front of the United States Congress in this war propaganda hearing, which took place in late September of 1941. less than 3 months before Pearl Harbor. The studio itself is loosely sort of based on Warner Brothers, and this very contentious relationship between Artie and Ned is loosely inspired by the relationship between Harry and Jack Warner. They were absolute opposites in many ways. Jack was this sort of flamboyant showman, and Harry was sort of the number cruncher in New York. The way in which Artie and Ned sort of fall out from the studio is also sort of loosely inspired by Harry and Jack Warner. Jack basically cheated Harry out of his stake in the company, and they never spoke to each other again. But there are also little details that I sort of drew from a variety of other movie producers at the time that I sort of inserted. So there's a reference that Ned ends up helping the Mercury Night Watchman open a hot dog stand after he retires, and that's something that Harry Cohn of Columbia did. There are various references to Ned's autograph collection. The founder of Universal Studios actually had a similar autograph collection. So I find that history is usually far more creative than me. So I steal details from reality wherever I can.
I understand that. I mean, sometimes I say, I can't make it up. So I just have, history is so much better. You can't make some of the stuff up that actually goes on. So just for now, I'll go ahead and open it up for some questions. I know, Carol, you had your hand up. Yes. Carol is from Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? So that's where she is right now. So you're on mute, Carol. We cannot hear you.
Well, actually, I live in Norton.
Wow, it's close enough.
But I teach at Leslie. So I've actually heard you on another pod on a YouTube, and I was wondering, you didn't mention Cambridge. You did say a small apartment. So I was really wondering where it was. So I wanted to just say hi and thanks for a wonderful book. And of all the eras of movies, this is my favorite, and I love Italy. But and my son is an actor in LA, and ironically, I'm going there next week. And I said to him, you're going to do one thing for me. You're going to take me to the red carpet the night of the SAG Awards. And he said, you absolutely are not going to make me do that. But anyway, I do have a question. But ironically, the question I was going to ask is about characters and you. And it's kind of ironic that you mentioned the Chain Gang, because Paul Muni was my cousin.
No.
So, yeah. Anyway, he was nominated.
That is wild.
Movie. But anyway, so I wanted to ask, you did talk a little bit about going to Italy, and you did talk about some of the Hollywood characters, but were any of the Italian characters based on anyone in your family?
Yeah.
Like anyone that you knew or grew up with in America? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to meet Paul Muni's cousin. That is very exciting.
You know that he didn't get the EGOT because there was no Grammy, but he did get the other three: Tony, Academy Award, and Emmy.
Wow, I did not know that. That's amazing. So yeah, we used to live in Cambridge. We lived on Prescott Street, right across from the art museum. And yes, a number of characters are inspired by several of my family members. So Maria's great aunts, Mimi, Lala, and Pep, those are based and named after my own great aunts. My grandfather had 9 siblings, and half of them died in childhood. And what his family did, there was so many of these kids passed away in childhood, that their names were simply passed on to the next in line. So my grandfather was also named Anthony, so he was named after an older brother who had passed away. Mimi, Lala, and Pep were each named after older sisters who had passed away. And from a family with a 50% childhood mortality rate, Mimi, Lala, and Pep lived to their late 90s. And as a kid, I remember they lived in Brooklyn, and we would go up. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and every couple of months we would drive up to Brooklyn to visit them. And they were just these tiny little, they were maybe 5 foot tall in their church shoes, but they, just thinking of all they had seen, all they had survived, they just had a really profound impact on me. And given the traumas of their childhood, they had a rather sort of bleak outlook on life. So my Aunt Mimi, who is the most prominent of the three in the novel, she lived to the age of 98, and she hated every single second of it. She was the porcupine was her spirit animal, and despite that, she always really doted on me. And so she, when my first book, Constellation, came out, she came to the bookstore, and this was I was doing a reading, and she came to this bookstore, and this was no small effort on her part, because she had this phobia of bookstores. She thought that they were fire traps, that with all of the kindling on the walls, one stray spark from a cigarette and we'd all die in a terrible inferno. But not neither her her fear of bookstores, nor the fact that her driver's license had been rescinded by the state of New Jersey, prevented her from driving to every bookstore she could find in central New Jersey after my first book, Constellation, came out. And she would go to the front of the bookstore and take all of the books from the front, all the bestsellers, and she would move them to the back. And she would take copies of my books from the back and she would move them to the front. And so I ended up outselling James Patterson at several bookstores in New Jersey, thanks to her. But she was the last of my aunts of my great aunts to pass away, and she did so in 2015, as I was already beginning to work on it.
Well, it sounds like you had very good people to write about, and as you say, history. But don't tell me they lived in Bensonhurst.
No, they lived in Sunset Park.
Sunset Park.
Yeah,
Okay.
but as I was,
I'm a Brooklyn girl, and now I'll mute.
All right, thanks, Carol. So,
sorry, I think you're on mute.
I thought I clicked myself up. I'm sorry. Thanks, Carol. We have another question from someone on iPhone that she went away. Never mind. Oh, Christine, yes. You want to join us? You're on mute now. Okay. Thank you.
I actually wish that you had gone with the 2-book format. I love the story of Ned and Artie and Maria, and the discussion of the reenacting. Lou, a Chinese had to play a Japanese because no Japanese could get a job. I found that whole thing fascinating. I wish that had been expanded and you'd actually done the 2-book format.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think I would say that what I found sort of one of the things that interested me most about the project was looking at how in these moments of political and sort of social upheaval, the practices that enemy nations put into place to to sort of exert authority over their citizens, how they begin to look alike. So I think that that what the enemy aliens in Los Angeles experienced, I think that kind of only becomes that only gets its tragic dimensions by seeing what Maria's father endured in Italy. So to me, I felt that if you didn't have that really close look at what life under fascism in Italy was like, you wouldn't have quite as much a sense of the tragic dimensions of how, in the very name of liberty, American policy was resulted in the curtailing of freedoms and rights.
Thank you for that. I didn't get that out of the book. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So while we're, before we go to another question, if you guys want to do a poll on characters, Mary, I'll let you go real quick, and then I've got a poll on everyone's favorite. So you guys want to do a poll first? Take another question. Poll, question. Mary, I'll let you go. Mary, unmute, please.
Okay, and it really, and I know I'm not on video, but it's more of a statement. I know, Sharon, you initially mentioned that it's rich. This was a very rich book. And the fact that we focus on World War II, that we forget about what happened at home. And, just the comment that was just made that we forget about the people here, but it wasn't only the people who are not U.S. citizens. The fact that you also introduced into the book what happened to U.S. citizens because of their heritage, and that the lines really got blurred. So I just want to thank you for including that in the book, because sometimes we forget in the pursuit of peace that sometimes we forget about what happened at home. So it's more of a comment and a statement and a thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. I appreciate it, and yeah, I think that that oftentimes in how in our own in how we tell history, because maybe because World War II was kind of the last war where we were undeniably on the right side of of things, that it's maybe easy to overlook the ways in which we perpetrated grave injustices against our own citizens. And as you mentioned, so Eddie's character is sort of a composite of a number of Chinese and Korean American actors who did have sort of their big breaks during World War II, playing these sort of very racist caricatures of Japanese Japanese villains. And one of the things about Eddie that in many ways I know you're going to do a poll, but in many ways he and Maria I think are among my favorite characters, and their just their love story to me it feels like kind of the heart of the book.
So interestingly enough, you get to play in the poll. I can't, unfortunately, because of my I'm like the admin. But let me launch the poll, and you guys know how this works, right? If I could find the darn thing, I'm the worst at this polls. There we go. So I'm going to launch. Here we go. So the question is, can you guys all see it? Which character do you enjoy the most? You get to pick one. And I will tell you what mine is when we get there. There you go. Somebody's like mine. Okay, I've got 19, 20, 20, 22, 23. Okay, everybody's participated except for one person, and I know who she is. Okay. Not you, Avery and Paul. Okay, you guys want to see the results? Can you see it? So it looks to me like Maria, obviously the protagonist, is everyone's favorite, many people's favorite. Someone besides just myself, I just thought Archie Feldman was fabulous. I just enjoyed him. So I don't know who else was that would agree with me on that. Christine, yeah, there you go. Someone like Nino, Vincent, and then no one seemed to relate to the German, Anna Weber, and a lot of you guys simply love Eddie Lou. So let me stop sharing that for a second. No, how do I do that? Is it gone?
Mhm.
Yes?
Yeah, it's gone.
Okay, great. I can't see on mine how that works. So out of curiosity, would someone who really liked Giuseppe or Archie, I'm sorry, Artie Feldman, kind of give us your thoughts on why you picked someone other than Maria as your sort of heroine or the person that you enjoyed most in the book? Anybody want to volunteer and go out on a limb? Christine, yes. Unmute. We can't hear you.
I really liked the treatment of Artie, especially in the end when he walked away with the $3 million and then gloated that his brother walked away with nothing, when he finally got his just desserts of getting his motion picture facility and company.
Right. I liked his tongue in cheek. I liked his boldness, his brashness, his fearlessness, his showmanship. I thought that was really a colorful character to add. Anybody else want to jump out and say who they like, Miriam? I got that look on your face.
I was trying to hide this week. I liked the great aunts. I thought they were great. You know, they just were like great grandmothers. You know, they were just warm and they took care of Maria. And so I guess I liked them the most. I have to say I didn't particularly like the book, but that's okay. I got stuck on the House Un-American Activities Committee kind of like right in the beginning. And so I ended up going off on this wild goose chase, like looking at the history of the HUAC. And I guess I didn't understand how it fit into the whole book until I realized that they actually started in 1938 with censorship about the films dealing with military and fascism and kind of watching what we were doing in terms of propagandistic type films. But like I said, I just kind of went off on this wild goose chase. So I did put a review up on Goodreads, so it's my opinion.
Okay.
Sorry.
Anybody else want to comment on the characters? How about someone who was in love with Maria? You guys are quiet tonight. Janet, come on. I know you've got a comment here.
I almost picked Maria, and it's been a while because I read that book so long ago now. I'm so thrilled that I found that book in the library when I did. The only thing about Maria that I guess why I didn't pick her was because of what she had done to her father. And Eddie, he just struggled so hard. So that's why I picked Eddie. Because he was so good and so abused. Yeah, I liked a lot of the characters though. And I just thought I liked the book a lot. So,
I must admit, I found Maria cold.
thank you for the reference to my suggestion.
You're welcome. I found her a bit cold. And I don't know if that was intentional on your part, Tony, or if it was just sort of, coming from where she was, that she hid herself from everybody, that's what she came across. But I didn't find her as likable as I found characters like Eddie or Vincent or Artie or others. So that was my perspective. I found her almost too reserved and kind of cold and flippant, but perhaps that's just the way she was, hiding herself from, facing the reality of what she had done and her past and her guilt that she had tried to subdue or at least tried to bury. Any thoughts on, did you write her that way deliberately? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that somebody in her circumstances, both as as coming to America as a refugee with a tremendous amount of guilt, trying to reinvent herself, coming up in a woman in a very male-dominated business. I think that that for so many different reasons, she, for both to survive and to sort of try to become, the person she hopes to be. I think it necessitates a degree of coldness and of repression to some extent. I think that in some ways she is much more like her mother than perhaps she would like to think in terms of I think that that some of her mother's coolness has rubbed off on her a bit.
Right. Did you base her on someone in real life in terms of in the picture business, in the motion picture business, or no?
No one in particular. There was during this period during World War II was the first instance where you did see a number of women become producers, which wasn't the case prior to that. So I was sort of interested in looking at how the social sort of tumult of that period allowed opportunities for advancement that somebody like Maria wouldn't otherwise have had.
Are there some other questions? Because I've got a couple more I could rattle off. Miriam, yes, ma'am. And then Sarah, yes.
I'll ask a question because I'm really curious. So I'm going to shift gears. Would you talk a little bit about your writing process? Do you catalog and plan all the characters? Do you figure out where you're going? Because you had to integrate these two really disparate themes. I'm wondering how you plot all of that out, or you just kind of go by the seat of your pants, and talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, so it's usually a little bit of both. That I think one way of that writers I think sort of describe the writing process is almost like headlights. So you sort of can see to the end of your headlight beam, and you kind of know where you want to go in that middle distance, but you need to actually drive further to see what's up ahead. So I usually have some sense of where I'm going, and will usually jot little notes down. But most of what I find most pleasurable about writing is that sense of surprise you get as a writer, as you stumble into a sequence of events. My cat is making an appearance. That you wouldn't have otherwise, figured out. I think that that if you're not surprised as a writer while you're writing, chances are nobody will be surprised as they read. And so I tend to err more on the side of flying by the seat of my pants.
Thank you.
Thanks. Sarah?
Hi, I also loved all the characters and spent much of my enjoyment of the book in the characters that you really gave life to. So I'm curious about your research process and what that looked like.
Yeah, so I mean, this is maybe why it took me 7 years to write is because when you're working on a book set in this period, you can sit in your pajamas watching old movies on a Tuesday afternoon and call it work. But for research, I tend to research is sort of like usually precedes the writing of the novel, and then it outlasts it. So it's kind of like the first thing that I do and the last thing to go. It sort of like begins as the process of like trying to feel your way into the novel, and then at the end it's almost a way of trying to hold on to it once it's already out in the world. So I find like memoirs useful. Reportage from the time I find incredibly useful. One of the books that was most useful was actually this old WPA guide to LA in the 30s, which is phenomenal. In fact, you can find online, there were WPA city guides to most major cities, and they were written by, preeminent writers during the 1930s, and offer so much like color and little details. I think that that as a writer, the details that always interest me are the ones that seem unbelievable, and I find that that my own kind of writing process is that anything that seems unbelievable has to be true, has to be real, and the elements of a novel that seem sort of commonplace, like those are the ones that I can invent. So something like German Village, for instance, which seems so outlandish, that's the most factually accurate chapter in the entire novel. But yeah, it's usually just sort of underlining a million different books, and if possible, traveling to those places, chatting with people, and then you're sort of like trying to synthesize all of this information into a story that the purpose of which is almost to try to understand what it is about this research that so fascinates you. I find that like the almost I see my books as ways of trying to understand my own preoccupations and fascinations with a particular place or time period or characters.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Debbie?
Hi, can you hear me? Just
Yes.
making sure. Okay, great. First of all, I really enjoyed the book. When I didn't really know much about the book, but what caught me was anything that has to do with filming. And you sort of answered one of my questions about the research, because I spent 45 years in film and television. So some of the references, and the period that I love the most is 30s and 40s. So when you spoke about different things within a studio, and you really nailed it. So did you spend a lot of time getting the details for what the studios were like back in the 30s and that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time just sort of like reading books from that period that were sort of about the film world. So one of my favorite was a book by an anthropologist named wonderfully named Hortense Powdermaker, and she was an anthropologist. She did her field research for a PhD in Papua New Guinea, and decided to look at Hollywood almost as one would as one would sort of any closed society with its own, rituals and taboos and, totems and all of that. So books like that were really useful, but in general, yes, like I would easily spend a day trying to figure out, one small little detail here or there, particularly because, my last two books were set primarily in Chechnya, which is a place where chances are I know more about it than the average reader, but that's definitely not the case when you set something in Hollywood and in the film and television world. There are millions of people who know it much better than me, and finally I have a number of friends who work in the film business. I went to the University of Southern California for undergraduate, and most of my friends were in the film program there, and so I was able to knock on their doors and get some answers as well.
Oh, good. Well, I appreciate it, because usually our industry is very secluded. People don't really know what goes on behind the camera. And so you really nailed a lot of details. So I'm just wondering how long you spent
Thank
time
you.
on it. And I do appreciate that, because usually people get it wrong.
Thank you. Well, I mean, coming from you, that means a great deal. I really appreciate it. And I do think it's one of those things where I think that Hollywood is often, when it's portrayed in popular culture, it's often, and particularly when it's portrayed in novels, I feel like it's often portrayed as this kind of world of, of idiots and a fundamentally unserious place, which in my, in my research and hopefully in the telling is not the case. That it's a fascinating, business above all.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. One real quick last question, because I do know that we want to leave get a little early, because I know that I'd like to have the group, part of the feedback I received in some of those surveys I did was y'all would like a chance to talk about the book without the authors. We have a chance of discussion, but really one last question and then we'll let you go. Tony, is in terms of the fate of Giuseppe, I like the fact that you left that open for the reader to discern what they thought happened to him. But did you have in mind what you think his fate was? This would be the father of Maria.
Yeah. I intentionally sort of left it somewhat open-ended, but not, he doesn't survive the war. So it's not, whatever befalls him is not good. And I sort of imagined it was something in relation to his assistance in Vincent Nino's jail.
Blowing up the mine, maybe, or blowing up the.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, I want to thank you very much for your time and for bringing us this book. Great read, and we really enjoyed having you here talking with us. And we hope to see you again with your next book. You have another one coming out soon?
In about 7 years.
7 years. Okay.
Thank you so much. This was
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very, very much. All right. All right. Good night.
Thank you.
All right, ladies. We have all ladies on the phone. We have a few minutes, 10 minutes or so. Let me turn the recording off. Sorry. How do I do that?